Now let's come back to the Temple of Serapis. Lyell is correct, the land sunk. However, his idea that a local flood can produce the layers around the world is nonsense. It doesn't work. Here's why. Here's what Lyell did not know. Now, of course, we got the Grand Canyon here. Down at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, you'll see this layer right here. At this particular point in the Grand Canyon, you can see what we call the Grand Canyon supergroup. That's these layers right here. You notice they're tilted. And they come up, they've been cut across the top by this one layer, which is called the Tapeats sandstone. Originally, the Tapeats sandstone was believed to be the shore of some calm, placid sea. It is now believed the Tapeats sandstone was an underwater mud flow moving at up to 90 miles an hour. But here's the catch. There is a map of the Tapeats sandstone. So explain to me how you are going to cover almost 1/2 of North America in an underwater ocean floor mud flow moving 90 miles an hour without a global flood. You can't. It demands a global flood. What I brought with me today, if I can find it, here it is. This is also very interesting. That sandstone is supposed to be hundreds and hundreds of millions of years old. There should be no animals that have evolved with bones by that point. Yet my good friend John Mackay, about 20 years ago, discovered a trail of these fossil footprints in the Tapeats sandstone. They're not supposed to be there. Those single tracks disqualified evolution right off the bat. They've been systematically ignored by the scientific community, which is why I brought it cast here today, so you could see it for yourself. Interestingly, you'll notice that the Tapeats sandstone also outcrops in my homeland of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, etc. 3 years ago, in a sandstone quarry, which is called the Potop sandstone, this is where it gets interesting, the Potop sandstone, which is right in there, about 3 years ago, Queenston University in Kingston, Ontario, found fossil footprints. They're not supposed to be there. These were from animals with bones. They were not supposed to have evolved yet. And so, what we have here, this is the same layer. That Tapeats sandstone that outcrops in the Grand Canyon is known as the Lamont sandstone down in the Midwest, the Potop sandstone way up here, up in Wyoming and Montana. I went there myself personally. There's the basement rock, and there is what they call the Flathead sandstone. It is absolutely identical to the Tapeats sandstone. It gets better than that. Okay, this is a model we just finished building at the Akron Fossils and Science Center. I was using it because it's easier to see. You can see the tilted layers here of the Grand Canyon supergroup. There's the Tapeats sandstone. And above that is a layer of green shale called the Bright Angel shale. Now in the supergroup right here is a layer called the Shinumo quartzite. It's a very hard rock, actually very pretty rose-colored rock. And within the Bright Angel shale, we have chunks of that rock that have been ripped up and transported that are the size of small cars. The Bright Angel shale, again, was supposed to be the bottom of a calm, placid sea. How is a calm, placid sea going to rip up blocks that big, transport them hundreds of meters, and bury them in suspension in the mud flow? It's not going to. Once again, this is evidence of gigantic catastrophe. When you take a look in the Grand Canyon, this is the Bright Angel shale. It's a very distinct olive green color. Let's head back to Wyoming, where I just showed you. There's the sandstone, and there is the exact same bright green or olive green shale. Exact same formation. We're talking continental global flood of massive catastrophe. It's profound evidence for a global flood. Now, this is a map of what is called the Austin chalk. And it was actually an anti-creationist who pointed this out, interestingly. Dr. Derek Ager talked about this. Everywhere you see the red is roughly where they believe the Cretaceous seas were. The Cretaceous period is the time of the dinosaurs. Okay? So everywhere you see red in the map is where they believe these Cretaceous seas are, and where we now have what is called Cretaceous chalks. These are the deposits left behind by these supposed ancient seas. And here's what Lyell didn't know. The chalk, of course, is named after Austin, Texas, where it's very predominant. This is in Glen Rose, Texas. It's a very white, yellow, chalky marl. And here it is in England. Outcropping is the White Cliffs of Dover. It's the same layer. Follow across the English Channel, you get over to France. The same layer, outcropping on the other side of the English Channel. You head on over to Germany, it outcrops as the Solnhofen Formation, which is very famous for fossils. That's where Archaeopteryx came from. That's where this fossil dragonfly came from. This is a layer that goes around the entire globe. So here is the catch. Lyell says it was a local flood. How can it be a local flood and make layers on literally every single continent on the planet? It even outcrops in Australia as the Gin chalk. It can't happen. Now here's the real catch. If Lyell is correct and the land sunk, every single continent sunk at the same time. That is impossible tectonics. And guess what it does? Makes a global flood. You can't win for losing. In either case, you have a global flood. This is what the geological evidence suggests. You have to have a global flood. Okay, now I mentioned this last night. Some of this will be repeat if you were here last night. But I wanted to cover this in a little more detail than I went into last night with the children. I kept it simple for the children. But the evidence from Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and all those areas is profound. So here's the dig, which you saw again last night. There's the truck for scale. There's the dig site itself. And again, just the sheer number of bones is just astounding. Every single one of these flags is a bone. That plastic, bone. Everywhere you see any of the either plastic or plastered gauze is all dinosaur bones. We had anywhere from 3 to 30 bones per square yard. Unbelievable numbers of dinosaurs. What we do is we dig them up. Jordan is working on a dinosaur bone there, which is the same size as my leg. One bone. And again, bone, 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 bone. This was a big, long, platy bone. Hadn't identified it yet when I was there. But what we try and do is dig around it, and we package it in tinfoil. And that's to protect the bone. We then encase it in a plastered jacket. And that's so we can transport it to the lab, where we then take it open and systematically remove the bones. It's a very tedious process. It'll be years before you actually get enough bones for one dinosaur. Years worth of work. This is 100 miles away in Utah. This is Dinosaur National Monument. And if you were to take a walk from our dig site to here, you would walk from dinosaur dig site to dinosaur dig site to dinosaur dig site. It's all the same layer. Probably millions of dinosaurs. And when you go to Utah, you can, if they ever open up Dinosaur National Monument again, I hope they do, it's a profound example of evidence for the global flood. When you take a walk inside, all you see is dinosaur bones by the dozens. So this quarry has now been abandoned and turned into a national monument strictly for display. And you can walk right up to these bones and get your picture taken with them if you want, including right down there. So you'll please notice they've all been ripped apart. They've been dismembered. Now, when you go to the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Alberta, they try and explain this away as some kind of river. I don't doubt that it was water that did this, that buried them and ripped them apart. The most common fossil there is not dinosaurs, but fossil clams. And you'll notice that these clams have been buried closed. They've been buried alive. What happens when a clam dies? It opens up and it disintegrates. These clams have been buried alive. Now, these ones actually came from the Paluxy, again, that Austin chalk layer. But you find fossil clams like this in the closed position literally all over the world. Were you aware that the top 3,000 feet of Mount Everest is covered in fossil clams in the closed position? It's a global flood. It's obviously a global flood. So the clams provide a big clue. It was clearly water that caused this. Now, when you go to the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Alberta, they try and explain it away. They show it a nice little picture of the Kennepeskow River. This is in Quebec. And thousands of caribou were killed in a flash flood. And, of course, it grouped them together in parts like that. First of all, you will not find those caribou today. Where'd they go? They rotted, they were scavenged, they washed downstream, etc. But you will not find remains of those caribou today. They haven't become fossilized mass graves. So their explanation doesn't explain it. Secondly, when you take a look at the map of the Morrison Formation, which is what we looked at, it covers 10 states and 3 provinces. This is not some meandering river. This was a powerful global flood. This is thousands of feet above sea level. This was not some meandering river. It is profound evidence of a global flood. I talked last night about Archaeopteryx, and there are several points to be made from it. I'm going to talk later on about why it is not evidence for evolution. But what I want to focus on is the various positions of the fossil. First things first, as I said last night, it's the size of a chicken. It is no longer the thickness of a chicken. It's now about the thickness of a chicken burger. A tractor trailer would have a hard time flattening it that much. That is an unbelievable amount of pressure. Now, stop and think about this. If the chicken had rotted away and it was just bones, would it have squished like this? No, because the mud would just go through the bones. So clearly the flesh was still there when it was crushed. But in order to crush it that thin, you're going to have to pile a mountain on top of this thing. Before the dirt turns to rock, before the bird rots, and before the bird turns to rock. Do you follow me there? So this is once again profound evidence of catastrophe. This is not long and slow geologic processes. We cannot be expected to believe that this bird hung around for millions of years without rotting or turning to stone, while slowly and gradually large amounts of dirt got piled on top of it. Impossible. But it isn't just Archaeopteryx. This is common throughout the fossil record. For example, I'll actually pass this fossil around. This is a fossil fish from the Green River Formation. And once again, pay close attention to how thin it has been squished and how meticulously preserved it has been. It is literally millimeter thick. If you could pass that around, please. Thank you. And it's very common in the fossil record to see that. Again, fish disintegrate within days. Actual scientific experimentation has shown the fish will dissolve and disintegrate within days. Even if you remove the scavengers, they're gone. However, you'll notice there are 22 fish on that slab. Again, this is part of the Green River Formation. If you look in the middle, you can actually see another layer of fish in the middle of the layers. And if you flip it over, it is nothing but fossil fish. Nothing but fossil fish. Stop and think about this for a second. You've probably all seen the National Geographic videos where you have schools of fish darting and swimming in unison. How on earth are you going to bury a school of fish like that in a mud flow? Because that is precisely what has happened here. It has to be a catastrophic mud flow. We are talking evidence for a global flood. And once again, a mountain of dirt has been piled on these fish before they rotted, before the sand turned to rock, and before the fish turned to rock. It is a global catastrophe, not some long and slow geologic process. Now, coming back to Archaeopteryx, aside from the geologic lessons that can be learned from it, you'll also notice that its head is arched back as far as it can possibly go. Now, this is what we call the death pose. It is so common in the fossil record that many have scratched their heads over it for many years. Some suggested that, this dinosaur or bird laid out in the desert. And as the desert heat dried the tendons shrunk and pulled its head back. Impressive sounding explanation. I argued against that for years. I said, well, wait a minute. If it dried the tendons on the back of the neck, what about the tendons on the backs of the legs? They're not pulled tight. The legs will be found in any position. The tails are sometimes found pulled back. Sometimes they're found in any position. So let's take a quick study of the death pose. I got a whole whack of examples here. Now remember, we're going to examine this scientifically. Is it possible the tendon shrunk? This is my good friend Creation Truth Ministries. This is Canadian Museum of Nature in Ottawa. Again, notice the tail and the legs. The tail and the legs. In this case, the tail arched all the way back. The legs, in this case, one in front of the other arched as far back as it'll go. In this case, the legs are pulled up, but the feet aren't pulled down. The tail is still there. The mouth is trapped wide open. In this example, once again, the legs take on different forms. The tail is bent back as far as it can go. The head's arched back really far. Again, the tail isn't arched all the way back. The legs, it's almost as if it was swimming and trapped instantly in rock. That's the way it appears. This is a bird. Again, Fossil Butte National Monument. Pay attention to the legs and the arms. Everything is different each time. Now, I mentioned this last night. Stopped in at the Ostrich Ranch in just between Phoenix and Tucson. I stopped in because I had been told ostriches, when they die, their heads fall backwards. So I stopped in and I asked them, explained my reason for studying this, and the lady was very kind. She said, yeah. She says, we know a chick is sick when it sits there and its head bobs back, and it'll fight it. However, when they die, and I was very clear to ask them about this, when they actually do die, you will find them in any position. That gives you an idea of just how fast these animals have been buried. Lastly, there was an article that just came out just this past year, June, in Paleobiology. Kevin Padian and Cynthia Fox did a whole pile of research that I've wanted to do for years. I've been arguing for years this was a sign of being buried alive and asphyxiated. Well, their conclusions were roughly the same. They said it was a sign of asphyxiation and not tendons drying out. Why? Cynthia Fox was actually a veterinarian. So she took all kinds of tendons, meat, all kinds of stuff, and they salted it, watered it, dried it. They tried to get that stuff to do anything, and it would not react in any way, shape, or form. The only way that the animals could react that way, their muscles could react, is if the animal was actually fighting asphyxiation, etc. So I was very pleased to see that article because it very much confirmed what I've been arguing for years. Lastly, the argument that it was a desert that did this, nonsense, because it's also marine organisms that have been affected. This is a Keachosaurus. I have a cast of one right here, which again, you'll please notice, I've now gotten to study 9 of these. 7 of the 9 have their heads arched to one side as far as it'll go, just like that, and just like this one here. But not just marine organisms, not just the Keachosaurus. This is a gigantic fish in the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Alberta. Again, notice the arch on the back. It was in death throes. Look at these fossil fish. Every single one of them is in death throes. Their backs are arched as far back as they can possibly go. This is not long and slow geologic processes. This isn't dead fish lying on the bottom of a sea. These are fish that are being buried alive and being asphyxiated to death. Incidentally, the Green River Formation, there was a scientific article that came out a few years ago. A couple scientists, guess what they concluded? These fish were killed by fossilization. Yep. Basically what they said was that minerals were coming out of the water so fast that it actually collected on their gills and asphyxiated them to death, and that is why they're like that. Again, clear evidence of catastrophe, not long and slow geologic processes. And here's another couple. This is from the Creation Museum in Kentucky. Again, notice the position of the head. Again, AIG Kentucky Museum. Okay. Several anti-creationists try and argue against the idea of a global flood using various evidence. Want to introduce you to something that's called cross-bedding. And has anybody here been to Zion National Monument? I'm curious. 1, 2, 2. That's it. Okay. If you get the chance, when you go to Zion National Monument, you can see crossbedding everywhere. Very pretty. It's awesome to look at. Phenomenal to visit. You'll also see crossbedding like this in the Coconino Sandstone of the Grand Canyon. Now notice, it's layered. There's a layer, there's another layer, there's another layer, and there's a layer on top of that. Within those layers are these strange angled crossbeds. Now if you take a close look at the crossbed, you'll notice it has 3 parts. It has a top set, the slope, which is the foreset. The top set is the curve, where it curves down. The foreset, and then the curve, which levels out at the bottom. So top set, foreset, bottom set. Now, some of these layers are literally thousands of feet piled high on top of each other. Okay, and there's a good close look at the bottom set. Again, this is at Zion National Monument in Utah, I believe it is. Now, within the Coconino Sandstone of the Grand Canyon, you will see fossil footprints. I got a couple of those right here. So this is Coconino Sandstone right here. And these fossil footprints, which were apparently either from an amphibian or a lizard, nobody knows because we weren't there, the fossil trails tell a lot of stories. Number one, and this is really unusual, they only ever go uphill. It's kind of strange. Why would they only go uphill? Often, they'll go uphill by going sideways, what we call crab tracking. You know, crabs walk sideways. So they refer to it as crab tracking. The toes are pointing uphill, but the creature is trying to walk uphill going sideways. It's clearly fighting something. What? In other cases, you will see the tracks go from very deep to shallower to claws only to completely vanishing, all within a few feet. So from an evolutionary point of view, what on earth is going on here? Did it grow wings and fly away? Did it tiptoe through the desert? What on earth is going on here? The conventional interpretation of these crossbeds is that they are fossil sand dunes. And in fact, when you go there, that's what they tell you at Zion National Monument. Look at the millions and millions of years of fossil sand dunes. Well, first of all, how do you fossilize a sand dune without a whole pile of water? Stop and think about it. Lastly, this does not explain the fossil footprints. This is a real mystery. Why would they only go uphill? Why would they go to tippy toes and then completely vanishing, all within the space of a few feet? So let's examine this scientifically. Does this refute a global flood? Nope. Here's an active sand dune in New Mexico. This is way out in the middle of the desert. Someone conveniently bulldozed through one for me so I could take a picture. Notice the layering in the inside. It looks almost cross-bedded, but you'll notice the layers go up and over. So sand dunes don't make cross-beds. They make waves. You can actually see that if you actually cut into a sand dune. However, when you go to White Sands National Monument, you can see what the wind is doing today. It's producing waves, not crossbeds, waves. Yet within those sand dunes, you can see crossbedding. And so some have argued that because wind is working it today, again, the present is the key to the past. There's that subtle assumption. Because it's being worked by wind today, it has always been worked by wind. That is their assumption. And therefore, they conclude that wind produces crossbeds, because we can cut into them and see the crossbeds. Nonsense. I would argue these were produced by water, and the wind is now destroying them. When you take a close look, there's the crossbeds, but look what the wind is doing. The top layer where the wind is affecting is horizontal. The wind is not producing crossbeds, it is destroying them. The present cannot be the key to the past. So, again, wind destroys crossbeds. Wind makes waves, not crossbeds. Now, I bring this up, this is a little technical, but I bring this up because there was an article put out a number of years ago by 2 creationists, Steve Austin and Andrew Snelling, and it was talking about water waves producing crossbeds. Now, I agree with these observations. I've seen it myself. I've actually produced these in a gadget called a flume. I may get to show you that later on. The water comes in through here and deposits sediments on this side, and so it makes crossbeds. These are not crossbeds, however. These are translatant climbing beds. They're different. But it does produce crossbed-like stuff. But the thing is, it destroys the crossbeds as they're made. It doesn't lay down crossbed after crossbed after crossbed. It destroys them as they're being made, exactly like the drawing shows. Others have also the planation surface, the top part, doesn't make that. Many have argued that this cannot produce the steep angles of the crossbeds, that water won't make it. The reason they do that is because they cite the article that Andrew Snelling and Steve Austin used, and they quote it, "We cannot emphasize too strongly that sand waves possess low to mild slopes, no more than 10 degrees. Now the Coconino sandstones get up to 20 to 30 degrees. So they said, see, water can't produce steep angled crossbeds. So therefore, these layers had to have been a sand dune. They can't have been made by a global flood. The steepest angle of repose for cross-laminated sand is about 33 degrees. That is a quote straight out of a geology textbook that says only air or wind can produce crossbeds steeper than 30 degrees, or 33 degrees. However, we produce crossbeds up to 36.5 degrees and more in a flume with water. Here's what happens. The water we had coming out of a cement mixer came in here at high velocity. Because the water is moving fast, it can carry dirt. We had standing water here. All that happened was the water came in, hit the standing water, came to a stop. It is now no longer moving fast, and it dropped it just like a conveyor belt. And we were able to make crossbeds after crossbeds continually. So the water's coming in from the left, moving to the right. Dead easy to make. Anybody can do this at home. You know how we made that? Notice it's going uphill? That's all it took. Water, dirt, and an uphill. It can be done with a global flood. This is a close-up video of, again, crossbeds being made, but the interesting thing that happened here, the water moving in so fast, it actually backs up and slams into this. What we did then is that we then took newts, basically an amphibian, and we put it in there while we made crossbeds. And we watched what they did. Guess what they did? Notice the water is coming back in and coming back this way. There is an eddy right there in the current. When we put the newts in, guess where the newts hung out? In the eddy, right at the bottom of the crossbed. And so what happens to get out of the fast current, there's only one way to go, uphill. And so it would go uphill, it would be picked up by the water, swept back in to the eddy, and one creature could make fossil footprints on multiple foresets. I had to explain why the tracks only went uphill. He said, well, it's simple. The tracks on the windward side of the dune were destroyed. So the only tracks that were preserved were those that were on the lee side.